Hello and welcome to Write Hive's 2025 online conference. My name is Dawn Vogel and joining me is Livia J. Elliot for an interactive fiction Q&A. Livia, thank you so much for being here. Let's start with a quick introduction from you for our audience.
Yeah, sure. But first of all, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about interactive fiction, so I'm very, very happy to be here. For those who don't know me, thank you for coming to this. I'm Livia J. Elliot. I have a lot of labels. I write interactive fiction in an app I developed alongside my partner, which is called Unearthed Stories. It's a mobile app for text-based interactive fiction. I also have 2 books published, The Genesis of Change and Dance With Me, which is actually the novelization of one of the interactive fiction pieces that I have out there. I'm also a podcaster. My podcast is called Books Undone. And yeah, that's all there is for now. So very happy to be here.
To begin with, we're going to start with a very gentle question, which is, what is interactive fiction?
Sure. So interactive fiction, I will define it as a literary genre that blurs the lines between the reader and the author, so that the reader has some agency into what's happening on the plot without some safe guardrails that the author has to present there in the story. It can be, you probably saw it on text-based adventures, the classical choose your own adventure books of yore, but it can also appear on interactive visual novels. There are a few games in which you just take choices, and it can also happen to a different extent in narrative-based video games. For example, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, nowadays Baldur's Gate, that type of games in which, in that case, a player has some agency. There are no rules to narrators or writing style. You can do it second person, first person, third person, multiple POVs, anything you want. However, if you go for text-based, it's going to be more like a book. If you go for visual elements, you will have to start understanding a bit more of how you write comics or visual novels to start bringing in those elements into the general interactive fiction. And it can be a bit daunting. It's just a matter of practicing and learning. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I grew up with the Choose Your Own Adventure novels, so that's my main experience with interactive fiction, but it's neat to see how it's grown and expanded since that point. So our first question that I have for you is, what are the key elements to consider before writing interactive fiction?
Yeah, sure. So something that I will recommend is from the technical to the writing. First of all, what type of tool are you going to use, right? Are you aiming for something that is text-based? In those cases, there are more scripting languages that you can use. Or are you going for something far more visual, right? In that case, Ren'Py, it's a good alternative, right? And why do you have to consider that? Because you write in a different way. If you go for something more visual, for example, you won't have to describe the character surroundings. You probably have a background image, right? But if you go for something text-based, you are leaning more into the book side, So you will have to describe, you will have to present choices, and so on. So once you have that defined, I will say consider your genre that you are going to write. It's not the same. Why? Because the genre will affect how you want the reader to react and the type of choices that you want them to have, right? For example, if you're writing a horror piece, you want to scare the shit out of your readers, right? And everything you do, the way you present the choices, everything has to appeal to the state or to the desperation or anything that you want to pull in from your readers, right? And that's why, because you have a basic mechanic, right? And that's game mechanics, if you allow me to define that, are basically the rules and the systems that govern a game and how the game functions and how the players interact with it, right? In interactive fiction, you have one key mechanic, choosing, right? So you will give part of the agency to the reader and they will choose. But what are they choosing? Are they choosing dialogue? Are they choosing to go somewhere? Are they choosing to leave someone to die? to face a monster. You know, how you write your choices into your narrative will affect the branching, and that will in turn affect how everything in the story happens, right? If you are choosing, I tend to experiment a lot with that, because the way the reader engages with the story will affect how they perceive, the story in general, what they feel through it. And that's incredibly important, because there has to be a consistency between, let's just say, the mood of your story and the mood of your reader, right? It's like reading a regular book. You're reading a book, battle scene or something, and you are bored, right? That doesn't have, that's very problematic, right? And if in the middle of the battle you pop up with a very simple question that doesn't actually come, like a very simple choice that doesn't actually convey the desperation of the battle, that can be jarring for the reader, right? So understanding what do you want to do in your narrative, what's the story about, and how you want to take it over, and what do you want for it to happen, that's incredibly important to start laying out everything you are going to do. Now, a bit of a disclaimer there. I'm a plotter, right? So most of my advice will be geared towards plotting and how you handle a story in terms of plotting. I have only pantsed a single story in my whole life, and it's an interactive one. So yeah, I'm not the best in that regard. Now, let me give you a very practical example from one of the stories that I actually wrote. It's called Restorers. It's a short novella, 70,000 words. It's interactive, and you play as a robot, right? But the whole theme of the story is that knowledge enables choice, right? So the robot has some programming, and it starts with some choices, right? But I couldn't give the reader a single choice, right? Because that would be pretty boring. So what I did was basically have the robot have aliases. So he will have 4 options: agree, acknowledge, above, the same. Why? Because as soon as it will create some, like, what the fuck? What did the writer give me the same 4 choices? And as soon as you take it, the robot says something like, I'm picking the aesthetic choice, or something like that. The more you play the story, the more you gather knowledge, the more options you start getting, up to a point in which there is that it's a key branching point in the story, in which you can either basically give away the independence the robot gained, or you can keep building on it. If you give it away, you slowly start getting fewer and fewer choices, and the narrative moves from a regular first person narration to full passive voice, right? So because and in the other case, no, he keeps saying, I did this, and so on, and taking ownership of the choices. So in that sense, you can also play, it's part of the narrative. It's not just an element, a fancy element that you have over there. Let me see if I can show you actually what I did with that in particular. That's the other bit that you have to take into account. How are you presenting the choices, right? Because you can, for example, present just dialogue, or you can present a decision whether to go right and left, and in that case, it will be just a body beat. You can do very weird things depending on what you are presenting. At the end of the day, it's slightly more video game, and you will be able to use those elements. So, for example, this is Restorers, right? The robot has a tendency to make quotes or quote things from a library that was banned. So you get that, as you can see, in a different alignment. But if you look at that, the choice is actually a code.
Very cool.
Why? Because it's a robot. The robot makes choices. And and in this case, he's doing a loop because he's going over the same thing, right? And I had to be very careful on how I will put that as it had to make sense to somebody who is not a programmer, right? But it has to give enough so they will feel that it's a robot, that they are actually playing as a robot, right? So how you present everything in there, it also adds to the building. Like, for example, I have, in some cases, put up the same choice 3 times. Like if your character is in a lot of distress, they are escaping the monster, they are running, right? You could give one choice that is run, 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 regular writing. Second choice in bold, run, run, run. Third choice in caps, run, 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 right? So it seems redundant, but the reader will have to read the 3 of them before making a choice, right? And that builds up the tension. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, the advice everybody says, show, don't tell. You can use the choices to show and to involve the reader, because if in that case, in that horror story, the only thing they can do is run in bold or run in caps, right? It starts affecting them because they are reading, right? So how do you do that? That's something I can't tell you. It's a matter of think of your story, think of the mood in a particular scene, think of how you can make it work, how you can just not only write, but use that single mechanic of choosing to make the reader feel something or to induce a feeling in the reader, right?
Yeah, like the choices that they're making are within the same theme of the story. So,
Exactly. Another one that I can tell you, it's Dance With Me, which is another one that I have. This one actually has pretty simple choices, right? It's a first person, you get a common choice. But what happens? The theme of this story, it's depression, right? And in some cases, the depression, if you look at it on the real world, sometimes you really want to do something, but you are depressed and you can't do it. Like you want to, but you can't, right? So what I did in those cases, that you will see that I'm a very mean writer. Like you will take the choice, and as soon as you take the choice, I will make the phone vibrate and I will strike through the choice and make the character do something else. It's incredibly frustrating for the readers. I have had a lot of people telling me that, but it's also a way of making them feel through the need of you want to do something, but the depression takes your agency away, right? So it's a matter of, I will say, being clever on how you do different things. What do you want to convey in that particular moment? And also another piece of advice, it won't come up quickly, Sometimes you have to just write everything, you have to practice, and then you will find out how to do it.
how do you balance player agency with authorial intent?
Sure. So I think that's the most daunting aspect of writing interactive fiction. And it's what I mentioned at the start. Like as an author, you are putting up guardrails, right? And you want your player reader to be able to make choices within the things that you are giving them, right? There are a few things to consider. First, the longer the story, the more exponentially complex it gets, right? Because the more choices that you are going to have to drag throughout the entire story, right? And that's something, the second point to consider. The choices not only affect both the main character, the one that your reader is controlling, but the secondary characters as well. So for example, you have the choice of your spy can stay under cover or can come out and shoot somebody else in a bit of anger, right? Even if they miss the shooting, that secondary character will react very differently if your character gets out of the cover with the hands up or if they just shot an arrow in their face, right? So every choice that you are making, it may not change anything in your character, but it may have consequences. That character that you just shot at may remain annoyed for it for several chapters, right? And you will have to drag it. So whenever you are making a choice or giving the reader a choice, think of the impact it will have not only on your main character, on the secondary characters, on the environment. If you broke a chair, that will have something. The chair cannot be there. The classical, if your character chose to just sit down, you have to keep them sit down until you give them the choice to stand up, or you have to make them stand up afterwards, So all the body beats, everything will be affected. It also depends. The second thing is ask yourself, what do you want to give your character, your reader, agency over? right? In some cases, you may want them to only have agency over talking, right? I did a whole story in which happens in a single room with the guy sitting on the edge of the bed. And the only choices that you have are what you tell somebody else and what memories you revisit, right? So they don't move. It's just about what you are thinking of. I did the opposite in another case. All the choices are where do you go, right? Left, in that case, it's always up or down because it's a dungeon crawler. And that's it. Where do you go affects the main character, but you're not choosing, generally, you're not choosing dialogue, right? So you can limit yourself in that way because it will make it more manageable, right? Or you can, for example, not sure how many of you have played Mass Effect, but you had a Paragon and Renegade, right? You can do that. You can give your character 2 modes and that's it. You pick one or you pick another. So in that case, it will be simpler because you already are defining that guardrail. You have the lawful good person, you have the chaotic evil, and that's it. You follow those 2 stereotypes. So that's a really nice trick. And something else that you have to consider is who is your playable character? Are you allowing the reader to construct that character by giving them a character creator, which will basically increase the complexity? Because if they can create a character, they should be able to have a variety of moods and attitudes and everything, right? But if you are forcing them to play one character only, like the robot I did, that's it. You can just give them different attitudes within that character and that's it, right? So those are also things to consider. Like I will say start small. If you have never written anything, go for a fixed character because that's what you will have in a book and play from there. Like you may have already a very defined character and let the reader player explore it, right? Not every story has to be about creating a character and living the story through that character. Sometimes a story can very well be about how that character explores a world, right? And the other thing, sometimes you don't need to have many endings. I think the most I did were 6 endings in a single story. It gets increasingly complex because the more endings you have, the more branching paths you may want to have. I have another story that has 2 clear. I did the Paragon Renegade thing. So one is green, one is purple. But the point in there is that your character also changes. One is in one path, the character is very aggressive. In the other path, the character is more introspective. It reached a point in which I couldn't just keep writing chapters side by side. I had to just write one path and then come back and write the other because the character was so different in every path, right, that I couldn't keep them consistent in my mind, right? So how your character is changing, it's also important, right? And as I said before, it's not only about the endings, how you get to the ending, that also is important, right? Because if you are getting, I don't know, by killing everyone to the end, like in Undertale with the genocide ending, that's pretty different to trying to save everybody, right? And the conclusion, they may reach the same point, stand in the same place, but the journey there is pretty different, so that you can also play with that. And for example, in one of the Unearthed Stories, we also invite writers. One of them did a very nice trick. Like if you go with one ending, you get one side of the story. If you go through the other ending, you get very different information. And the only way of understanding what was really happening is by reading both endings, right? Because at the end of the day, replayability is a thing, just as rereading a book is a thing, right? For example, in books, The Name of a Wind is a book that everybody will tell you you have to reread it to make sense of it, because you will find clues, right? And in these cases, the how you get there to the ending is important. If you read both of them, you can give your reader different information as well, right? And that makes the replayability far richer as well. So all of those things are also things that you have to consider in terms of branching, right? Because at some point you may want to have a very short branch. Your character is killed right away. right? But you have to tease your reader in a way that they will get frustrated and want to keep reading, so they will come back again,
Ah, all right. I think that sort of feeds into this next question. How do you design choices that feel meaningful rather than superficial?
I think it's again, in this case I will speak mostly of text-based choices, right? Because that's what I have been working on. So not every choice has to branch completely, right? You can have, suppose that you have a scene, a character comes in, you don't need to have one choice about punching the character, the other about saying hi. You can greet the character on both choices. What matters is how you write the option so that it doesn't seem like you are basically giving the reader no choice, right?
Mm.
So if you, for example, using the same words, one choice says, hello, dear friend. The other choice says, hi, my friend. It's pretty obvious that you didn't want to give your reader a choice, right? So, for example, another one could be, hello, my dear friend. The other could be, just give the character their hand and hug them, right? It will have a very minimum impact that you could probably solve with changing just the following paragraph and then merge the story back again, but it will build up your character, right? It will build up how the reader perceives a character. Like if they are always hugging every person that they meet, in their mind, they will complete the character to make it feel a completely different person if they are only shaking hands, and keeping everyone at bay. So that's something important is, do you really need to branch? Do you really need, and for how far? Because at some point, some choices are a single sentence. They have an impact of a single sentence and that's it, right? Another example that I can give you is you have two characters talking, right? You can allow one of them to sit or to remain standing. What will change are only the body beats during the length of that conversation. It won't extend far than that, but it will give, again, it gives a perception of agency. Because at the end of the day, you are not giving agency to your reader, you are creating the illusion of agency, right? They can choose only within what you are offering them, right? And if you do that well, the moment you take the choice away, like I did with giving you run, run, run all the time in that prior example, that will feel far more impactful, right? Because suddenly they could choose to fight the monster or escape the monster or do whatever, but suddenly they can only run. That creates an impact that keeps building into that perception. And what I probably will talk about that later, the ludonarrative harmony, how the mechanics build into the story and how you weave both of them together, right? So don't get, and a piece of advice will be, don't get over worried about branching and making, choices that actually branch the flow of the story, because you don't need them, right? Sometimes you can, every now and then you have to, but you can branch, for example, not necessarily in terms of where the story goes. You can branch, like in Mass Effect, over the character personality, right? The event that happens, the battles are the same, you go to the same planets. What changes is only the character and how they react. So you can do that, or you can only change where, So again, put up limits so that the limits are helpful both to you as a writer, but also like the guardrail of the playground that you give to your reader, right?
Mhm. And
Yeah.
talk a little bit about some approaches to handling consequences of choices across a long narrative. And you talked a little bit about that already, I think,
Yeah.
with the idea that not everything has to be a large branch. But when you get into something larger, like the novella that you mentioned earlier, I'm imagining you've got a lot more choices and they build on each other. So how do you handle that?
Sure. So there are a few things to consider, which will be who is impacting your first character, your secondary characters, the length of the impact, the ripples of the impact, like will be like the consequences of the consequences, and when it is discovered, right? So as I said before, if you shoot that arrow to your secondary character, they are probably going to stay angry, right? And you can play with that. You don't want to drag this character being angry. So in that branch, you can give your character the choice to apologize. And that will just, branch for a bit and then bring the story back. You only, from here on, once they apologize, that's it. That's everything you have. Or, for example, when you are going to offer a choice that is very impactful, for example, in one of the, I have done a lot of things, so you can see I am very mean writer. I gave you a choice in one of the stories in mean to kill the child, literally. It's a grim, dark story, so your main character can choose to kill a child because that's the only way to get them information out of them, or they can just let them go and forbid them and forgo the information, right? That has an impact, but what happens? They tuck the corpse away if you kill them. So that means that there are passing comments of a search, and it isn't until several chapters ahead that you actually find out what happened, right? So that's a span of the consequences. It doesn't have to happen immediately, right? Some choices are delayed. If you eat a lot of food, probably you're going to be fine for a couple hours and be sick the next day. That's a concept. Basically, you have to define that. And how do you build up until then? Because if your character just kills somebody, they are in that impasse, nothing may be happening, but they may be having thoughts about it, right? So that's a more personal impact, right? And after that, you can decide to merge back. In that case that I gave you of the character that you can kill, the consequence is that you won't be able to save someone else because that someone else finds out and no longer trusts you, right? So it's not a matter, again, of what happens to the plot. It's what happens to the secondary characters, right? And how do you track the choices? That's also something quite important. Like, again, what are you branching? Because suppose that you have this horror story, right? You branch at some point, you can go to a room, but in that room there was a clue about the monster. Your character knows that information, and now that you will have to track that down, right? So it's not only about where they were, their state of mind, what they know is something that it's also important, right? So, yeah. And I saw a question there, how long before giving a choice?
Yeah.
That really depends. In Unearthed Stories, what I generally do, it's like you have generally 2 paragraphs and that's it. Like I wouldn't allow to scroll more than that, and at the most 1 page without choices, right? So that will be roughly 150 to 200 words, right? Why? Mm-hmm. Because the reader's expectations. If you go for a book, you're expecting to just read. But if you go to read an interactive fiction piece, you are expecting to have agency about it. So how long can you tease your reader with not having agency? That's the point. So in some cases, suppose that they are having a rapid fire dialogue, you may want to do smaller choices, right? Just a tiny bit of dialogue and then you choose how to respond. But if they are, I don't know, traversing the desert, right? You may want to just have a different choice, a different style of choice in that case, or you may want to have more text so that it drags off and then you make the choice, offer the choice, right? And also the type of choice matters, right? If you are giving those fake choices that I gave you the example of a run in different ways, I would recommend don't do that very often or very close to each other because it gets frustrating, right? So you have to alternate the type of choices as well so that the reader actually feels that they are not just your puppet, remember, you have to keep the illusion of agency going on. So you can tease with the lack of it to some extent only. Yeah.
Then we had another question. I sometimes have trouble deciding how interactive to make a story, often ending up with few endings or kinetic novels. So in the planning stage, what advice do you have for truly creating more of a branching story?
Yeah, I will say like what type, think of a mechanic first, right? Suppose that you want to do the Paragon Renegade of Mass Effect, right? That will give you that's enough, right? Because you will probably have the same ending, but you will reach the ending Paragon style, or you will reach the ending Renegade style, and that changes only within the character. That's a path of the how matters, right? The things that you have there, and you will have smaller choices or smaller consequences that impact the entire narrative, right? If you want to completely branch out, what I will say is define points in the narrative that actually branch out, so that you are aiming for a Y shape, right? So you have one path, then it branches up. You have this event and this branches up, right? And then again, you can do it again. Once you have that key structure of plot events, then you can decide within each of the paths whether your character is the same or not, right? So you may have just that Y shape, but very early you may have allowed your reader to choose an attitude, effectively creating 4 endings, right? 2 for each attitude, even though the plot events are the same, right? So the other thing is, on the planning stage to create branches, what I will say is not only plot events, characters. Characters may go, and you also have the ability to do random stuff. Depending on the platform that you are using to write the interactive piece, right? Some of them allow for randomness, in the sense of you can basically create a random number as if you will be throwing a dice in a way that is transparent to the reader. So you may set up random events in the background, that when you reach a point, you have 4 options, one of these happens, that's it. It will be something different depending every time the reader plays, So you can also do that. It's what I will say in terms of planning, it's be mindful. Once you plot an event, ask yourself, what if? What if my character follows the villain? What if my character, what if Anakin would have said no? That's the type of question that you are asking. And from there you branch. And also my second piece of advice in that case, it will be the more branching, the more exponential it gets. Right? So try to keep it short. You can do in 7,000 words that Y shape and keep it very short, and that will be a great place to start with the branching.
Yeah, there's also been some folks mentioning that there is a 300-word interactive fiction from Neo20. And then, it's like, little bitty things that you can do that with.
Yeah,
And I actually have seen someone do in under 750 words, write essentially 8 separate stories, just by having them branch in that Y shape. So there's a lot that you can do, even in a small
exactly.
word count.
And
Let's see.
that's the
Oh,
beauty of it. The shorter it gets, the more savage your branching can be, right?
mhm.
Because the longer it gets, the more you have to track of, the more plot events that you have to tackle, right? Like I think the craziest one I did it's a dungeon crawler. It has 187 ways to cross a whole dungeon. It drove me mad. It's 140,000 words, right? And at that point, I had to start putting up like thresholds in which I would deny the choice of a reader because I couldn't keep up with the variability that I had created. So you don't want to reach that state, right? And as I said, as you mentioned before, the shorter it gets, the more branching. So yeah, the more savage your branching can get. Everything is more different because of that. Yeah.
So we've got a question about publishing interactive stories, and I'm going to hold that one for a little bit later, but we will get to
Okay.
that. Um, so you mentioned earlier the Ludo narrative, and you sort
Yeah.
of briefly described that, but can we talk a little bit more about Ludo narrative and then how that will affect plotting as well?
Yeah, sure. So that's something that happens also on tabletop games, any type of games. So the ludonarrative harmony or dissonance, it refers to the alignment and the coherence between the mechanics, that's a ludo side, and the narrative and the events that are happening. When you have that harmony, so when your story builds a mood and your mechanics build that same mood, it enhances the story because you will feel more immersed on it, right? And it can be, if you go to the visual side, it can be something as simple as the angle of your camera, right? And everything that you are doing in there, or the music, everything plays into this. So you want both of them to be aligned so that it reinforces the situation in which your character is in and actually creates that, yeah, the emotional link of it's not happening only to the character, it's also happening to me. You know, it's something that in a book, I will say it's a bit more difficult to achieve because you are relying only on words. In here, you can pull up from effects, you can pull up from fonts, everything, the type of choice you give. If you have music, if you have visual, suppose that you are doing a visual novel, suddenly everything turns grayscale. What does that mean? What emotion is it giving you, right? So everything here can work. The example I can give you in a very visual game is Tomb Raider 2013. There is a scene in which Lara Croft is going on a very narrow space with the water up her neck, and the camera is positioned in a way that you get the water up and down, right? So you can only move forward. You can't sink because they are forbidding you from sinking, from jumping, anything. But the camera is always moving, right? And that's creating that effect of the water is up my screen, How do you achieve that in the text? What do you do in there? That case of you are escaping the monster and I only give you 3 choices and all of them are to run. It builds up into this, right? It's building up this type of mood. That's why I will say, be crazy with your choices. It doesn't have to be only dialogue. That's I will say the first thing everybody think of, I will give you thoughts, dialogue, and where to go as a choice. It's not the only case. You can do basically anything that serves your story. But suppose that you have the opposite. You are escaping the monster, and the only choices that you give your character are to have dialogue that explains what's happening. It's going to feel a bit jarring, right? So that's not what you want. And that jarringness, that's a ludo narrative, not the harmony, the dissonance, right? Because the choices that you are giving, the mechanics, do not enforce the story or the mood of the story, right? So another case that I can give you, suppose that your character is pretty anxious. You can give them thoughts, and you can give them thoughts that are pretty loopy, right? That they seem to be going always on the same theme, right? Because that's how anxiety feels. You can, because you are writing, you can also appeal to literary tricks, make your sentences shorter, make your sentences longer. There are a lot of things that you can do in that sense, but you always have to ask yourself, is it building up? A great way of knowing whether it's working is if you give it to somebody and at some point they tell you, I was bored, and the point of that thing was not to be bored, then you are doing something wrong. It's time to check, what's happening in there. That's a feedback. And again, when you are giving that to your testers, make sure that they are not only reading, that they are experiencing the whole thing, because that's also what will build up to understanding whether you are doing it right.
Yeah. So we have a follow-up question about the ludonarrative harmony, and that is, what tips do you have for coming up with interesting choice mechanics that create ludonarrative harmony instead of defaulting to do X or do Y as the choices?
Yeah. That one is a bit difficult because, first of all, it depends on your story, on your genre, right? As you can probably see from the examples I gave you, I write mostly speculative fiction. So for each scene, ask yourself, what's the mood of the scene? That will give you, and what's the state of mind of your main character, right? If they are, not every choice has to be like a bunch of text, right? you can just give them like a little bit. If they are scared, a simple run in italics, a second one, that can work pretty well for the text of a single choice, right? So think of the state of mind of your character and how will they consider their options at that moment. That is a very simple way of defining the first thing. The second is try not to do too much in a single story, right? So if you decide for one mechanic, for example, in Dance With Me, I decided for that mechanic of whenever the character is too depressed, I will take off your choice. I will give you the choice, allow you to take it, and then strike it off, right? That was the only weird thing that I was doing for the whole of the story, right? Because the more you do, the more it muddies the effect, right? And I will also say, if you are using one type of effect, for example, a strike through, be consistent. Use it throughout the whole story. If you are using italics to enhance something, don't use it for anything else during the entire narrative, because your reader will associate italic choices means he's rushing, right? And that's it. Or they will say italic choice, that's a thought. That's it. Don't mix it up because it can get confusing, right? So if you're writing, suppose that you are writing a story about a drunk guy, right? You can play a lot with everything that person sees while drunk. You can start rotating the letters. You can start doing weird things, right? So is a state of mind important? Like the book that I will mention in that regard is A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. Not interactive. He plays a lot with the mindset of a character. So is the mindset of your character first and foremost? Do you want to make your choices about the mind state of your character, right? Everything else falls from there, right? If your character is trapped in a dungeon like the one I did, of course, going A or B makes sense. They want to get out of a dungeon, right? So I will say, pick one single element that is the most important of your story and build your choices around that. Is it mood? Is it placement? Are those thoughts? Are those memories? Anything. But pick that element and stick to it, and above all, be consistent.
Awesome. Okay, let's talk about creating characters who adapt believably to the different choices. And you've talked a little bit about characters and how some things change your main character, whereas some things change your secondary character. So what do you have? What are some tips that you have on creating the characters that work well with those maybe two different sorts of stories?
Yeah, sure. So for the secondary characters, I will say that's the easiest one and the most similar to a regular book. So you have to, if you take the choice A, where does the secondary character goes to? How are they impacted? That's it. And by secondary character, I mean in those cases, the one that your player is not controlling, everybody else, right? So in those cases, they will just have the consequences. If your character is always rude to them, you are always picking rude choices, they will start answering in a very rude manner as well, because they get fed up, right? If you suddenly have your secondary character injured, they lose a hand, how does that affect their body language or their mindset, right? So in that case, it's just like for every choice, take your time to think whether it's affecting the character and how will that drag. Because if suddenly they lost a hand, be careful for them not to suddenly respawn the hand because you forgot to drag through the choice, right? I know it's silly, but it can happen, right? So that one I will say is the easiest one. Now, the main character, I will say it depends on how extreme is the change, right? Because in that case that I mentioned, this is a story that I did, the Paragon Renegade thing, green and purple. It reached a point in which I couldn't keep up with the character. It had branched so much, and I was basically trying to write each chapter side by side for every narrative, and I couldn't keep up. So I just dropped an entire line, wrote one from beginning to end, and then wrote the other one from beginning to end, because I needed to keep the consistency in my mind, right? So that's the other thing. It's like, what do you as an author need to keep that consistency? You can write the whole thing, just, put a placeholder for the choice and then revisit that afterwards. And then I will say, once you have written the whole thing, reread it, making from beginning to end, following a single pathway, right? So this time I'm only going to be rude. Follow the whole rudeness. Does it hold up? And on the middle of it, start in the second run, do the same, start very rude, and start taking different choices. What happens if suddenly they have a kind moment? The secondary character should be shocked. It's not a kind character suddenly doing another kind thing. This is an asshole suddenly doing a kind thing. Your secondary characters will have. So when you are creating those characters, or you are branching on the character's mindset, what happens if they suddenly go the other way? You will have to make that consistent, right? So I will suggest, if you play, for example, Dragon Age 2, you have 3 mindsets. You have a kind person, you have a more ruthless, and you have a sarcastic one. It reached a point in which some of them will get blocked. You wouldn't be able to pick any of them anymore. So is that something that you want to do, or do you want to handle the complexity of, for example, this rude person suddenly did something kind and then everybody reacts to that, and then you go off as if nothing happened, right? So that's also something. But I will say, yeah, depending on, do whatever you need, but based on how extreme you want to take that as well, right? And also the other thing will be, try to keep the character arcs somewhat similar. If you do one pathway is like a hero's journey and the other is a descending arc, you will have to branch very quickly, right? And it will be very extreme, right? So you probably want the same, keep the events and the places the same, like in Mass Effect, just branch the character and impact everything else from those choices, right?
And have you ever felt that readers are drawn more toward customizable you characters versus defined characters they play as? And should you consider the position of the player as deeply as in more traditional games?
It's a complex question, and I
Yeah.
will say, don't bother about your reader, but do what is best for your story. Because if you pick whatever is best for your story, it's more likely that the readers are going to be engaged on it, right? If you want to tell a story about, I don't know, something pretty dark, and they suddenly pick something that is very cheerful, and you give them choices that don't make sense, but you feel forced to give them a choice, it may not work. Sometimes you want them to have the ability to create something that is somewhat unique, in the sense of you are placing those guardrails and it's an illusion of creation, basically. Sometimes you just want them to experience something as is, to live the story as is a specific character, right? So I will say, just do whatever works for your story in particular. And if you are doing it correctly, the readers will likely enjoy it, right? That also, I think it also ties up to where do you want to publish it. Because in some platforms, you will be expected and forced by contract to do extreme customization, to offer extreme customization, right? If you are publishing in something where you have control, then, as I said, whatever serves your story, right?
The best way to publish an interactive story, or some of the options that are out there?
Yeah, sure. So there are, first of all, getting into publishing interactive fiction in a way like you will do with a find an agent and do that more traditional publishing, it doesn't really work. There are some apps in which you can publish, but in those cases, again, you have to follow the rules. And in some cases, you will have to pitch. There is a high rate of rejection, and so on. If you are starting and if you have nothing of your own, itch.io is a great place to start. You can do a lot of platforms that allow you to create interactive fiction, like RenPy, or a lot of the different scripting systems will speed up something that is web-based, and you can put that up in Itch.io. And in Itch.io, you will be able to play online. They don't have to download anything else. That's it. That limits also how you use the engine, of course, because if you can't control the engine, and if you are going only web, that's something, right? You can create your own web, but that will mean that you will then have to try to get people into that web. If you go for a platform like Itch.io, that may be easier. If you use things like RenPy or those other engines, you may get a game that you can put up in Steam. That's a whole different thing, because you then have to have the game green lighted, go through a publishing thing, it's a bit more complex. Some platforms are easier, right? What I did directly, as I said before, I created with my partner Unearthed Stories. Why? Because we wanted a very specific engine. We developed everything ourselves. So that's a very do-it-yourself way. I wouldn't recommend that. So that's something else. Itch.io, I will say it's the basics. And basically, you can build up a portfolio there because it's free to read. You can have everything there. You don't need anything but a browser, right? And then if you want to pitch yourself, if you want to pitch your work, you can do it very easily. There is no installation as a barrier entry, no software, nothing to pay, right? So that's the easiest one.
And could you repeat what that one was that you mentioned could get games onto Steam?
RenPy. So if you want, I can give you I will post in Discord after
Okay,
I have
perfect.
like a slate with all the different engines that you can use.
Beautiful.
And of course, some of them are more coding. I'm a software developer by trade, so I go for full scripting coding. There are others that are more visual, right? Again, the more you go towards the code, the more control you will have. I will say start easy, right? Yeah. Tame your inner writer, start easier, because you have a lot to learn. And it's better to use a simpler engine and have a simpler story that's actually super meaningful with a very nice harmony, than to try to bite more than you can chew, right?
Yeah, it also seems wise to, when you're just experimenting it, do it on easy mode first and then work your way up,
Exactly.
Much like you would when you're trying to learn to write regular fiction.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's see. What is the most difficult aspect of writing interactive fiction, do you think?
I will say making the choices carry through. It's irrationally easy to suddenly create a plot hole simply by forgetting a choice. So, and you will, of course, the definition of plot hole can vary. You can make very groundbreaking things. So you can simply, for example, that case of your character shooting the face of another one, suddenly everything is fine. It didn't have an impact. That's a problem. The reader will just go like, what? But I just shot them.
Right.
I should be angry. So that's the most difficult thing to carry through. It's the impact of your choices. That's why at every stage you have to be asking yourself, like, am I actually carrying through the choice? And that's a problem because as a writer, you have all the variability in your head. You have all the options, all the versions of the characters, they all live in your head, and that can be incredibly confusing, right? So you will want to read your own work multiple times, following different paths, right? Because that's the best way of picking up a problem, right? I had one of them, we do invite writers to Unearthed Stories, and I had one of them, and I warned them of this, and then I had basically when I read them, I told them, like, you gave a very important choice here. Like your character was angry to another or distrusting them more likely. And suddenly everything is fine because they had completely forgotten to carry that through. And when you are writing, you don't see that. You won't see it because, as I said before, you have all the pathways. It's like if you were writing a book, suddenly the plot doesn't work and you decide to rewrite half of it. You are probably getting confused about what was there and what you created now, right? So don't be afraid of putting up like points in which you are going to stop, right? Writing and start reading again on a single path, right? And if that works, if there are no consistency issues, then you can go on, right? Otherwise, you will want to revisit that. But yeah, I think that's the biggest warning that I can give you. It's like, remember that you know everything. You're the omnipotent thing in there that knows exactly all the different states, and it can be confusing to keep all of that in your head, right?
And I think that that's true of some fiction as well.
Yeah.
When you've written something and you've been so immersed in it, you're like, oh, well, of course this makes sense. And then you have someone else read it and they say, no, that actually does not make sense. You skipped a
Yeah.
part. So
It did
yeah.
happen to me a few times that I was writing. I tend to write and play what I'm writing at the same time, like very often. And one day I was just in the mood, I just wrote like 3,000 words the whole day. I was like, this is so cool. Next day I come in and I was just like, didn't she just get out of the room? Why is she still in the same room? I had completely messed up the rooms in the placement of the characters in one of the choices, and I didn't realize, So that's why it can happen. And the problem with that is that the longer the story and the earlier that happens, the more you will have to fix, right?
Yep.
So don't mess up with interactivity. Be careful, be respectful of the interactivity that you are creating, because you can create a monster in terms of the combinations that you have out there. So writing and reading, I will say it's fundamental. It's far better to skip the first draft phase and try to get a polished chapter before moving into the next chapter, because you are always building on all the previous choices, right? So as I said, that it can get exponentially complex, and having a solid base to move on can pay off in future headaches. Rewriting an interactive is not as easy as rewriting a regular book. In the book, at the end of the day, they may skip the prologue, but you have the whole thing through, right? They will read in order. So
Yeah, I had a case in my novel where I had 2 Wednesdays back to back. So, finding little things like that, you then have to change everything
exactly.
else. So,
And sometimes fixing the problem can be just as fixing a body beat. Sometimes it can be very simple to fix. Sometimes, oops, I forgot the character had lost an arm.
yep.
So yeah, that's why it's so important to track that.
So we have a question. Is it more challenging to create separate endings or to have all the choices leading to the same place?
Oh, so I have done both. And the one that I had the most trouble with was actually having all the choices leading to the same place, because the character will arrive there differently, right? If you are keeping the places intact, then what you are changing is the character. So that will have a lot of impact. And the case that I had was the dungeon crawler that I did. It's this one, if you want to read. That is the one that I mentioned before. I had this great idea, I planned ahead of me, of having a dungeon, and what matters is the dungeon is an allegory. So the more as you traverse it, the dungeon changes, and of course your choices are where you go, right? So, but they all lead to the exit of the dungeon. So the problem was really the main character. They will know different things. The rooms will give them different knowledge. Things will happen in the room that will affect their own experience, right? So we have what they know, the people they met, the attitudes they gained, the knowledge they gained as well, because they may learn like a trade, they may learn to do like a bonfire or something, So those are the things that you have to keep track. And in those cases, what I will say is try to avoid the randomness of using randomness to lead your character places. Try to control how they go based on the choices and in the attitudes, because the more things you combine, the more complex it can get, right? And if you're doing that, the endings that lead to the same place because you are branching on the character, my recommendation is pick one version of your character and write it beginning to end. Because that will help you as an author be consistent. The process you use to write your story doesn't matter to the reader. What they see is the finished product, right? Mm-hmm. So once you are done with that, while you're writing, I will say take note of those what if I chose this, right? And keep writing. Then pick up another attitude and start writing that from beginning to end, right? Because what you want in that case is the impact of how they arrive to that same place, right? It's a matter of, like Brandon Sanderson, journey before destination. The journey matters in that case. Plot the journey, the internal journey of your character. Now, in terms of separate endings, I will say the challenge there is how long it takes to get there, right? Because if your story is very short, and you arrive to the ending very quickly, then probably you don't have to carry that many choices, right? And the other thing with separate endings is, are you really making them separate, or it's just like, I arrived at night versus I arrived at dawn? And that's it. That's the only thing that changes, If you want to make different endings, they have to be rewarding enough as to be different. You can combine them. You can do separate endings, and within each ending, different attitudes, right? So you will have branch on the character, but then again, keep them smaller, because the fewer you have, the easier it gets to write, at least to start as well. Yeah.
I feel like we've already sort of talked about the craziest thing that you've tried in interactive fiction. It definitely sounds like that dungeon crawl, because that seems very complex. Has there been any other ones that you've done that you felt like were particularly wild things that you tried?
So in that one in particular, I broke the fourth wall in the sense of it's quite crazy, that story. You have one character which is narrating in third person, which is not common in interactive fiction, and it's narrating your story of the main character, and the main character appears on first person. So you have the choice of following the narration or not. And if you don't follow the narration, you will make an enemy of the narrating character. It will reach a point in which they literally kick you off the story, and you get a pop-up. And it says off you go to the real world, that's it. The story closes. So that was pretty hard to handle. And my partner is a developer of Unearthed Stories. When I came to him with that, he was like, "You are crazy. That's going to take so much time." But we did it. It's pretty interesting, because you want to keep the reader engaged. And in mobile apps, you want to keep them in the app, but I'm kicking you off for a purpose. Because if I kick you off there, the ending is pretty open and unrewarding. And I was trusting that you will be angry that it happened. And because it's so sudden and it doesn't happen very often, so that it will actually tease you to come back. The other weird thing that I did, and if you want to play it, it's this one, and it's very short, but that one remembers that you finish it. So when you play the story, once you finish the ending, there will be a revelation around the theme that the story is about language and being able to express things because you have the language for it. So once you finish it, and if you restart it, there will be a different text in some places, and you will have more information because now you have the language and are able to explain it. So we had to code in the whole system for the story to know that it finished and that you finish it, and move it on from there, to actually have the story. That's what I said. We own the platform, right? So I can literally just code anything that I want into it. So that's something. Other weird things that I have done, I have another one, this one, which is also, if you like The Martian, that type of stories, you may like that one. It's multi-POV. So every chapter you are playing with a different person, right? And they are recurrent POVs, like you have, I think, 7 of them. But I had 2 main problems. First of all, I imposed myself to write only the small people. So they are not politicians, they are not leaders, they are a radio amateur, a scientist. So the choices that they make are very small choices, right? How do they ripple so that the other characters feel the effects of this? For example, you can play one character as very fearful or very courageous. Depending how you play her, that affects the choices, because you are not going to be, another character is not going to be able to convince the fearful version to do something, and that will change the ending, right? So in those cases, I wanted to play with the fact that we are a community. It doesn't matter if it is worldwide. The choices one person makes, a country makes, affect everybody. So that's what I wanted to play with. And that's why I imposed myself to do just the smaller people, small choices, and how they ripple. It's far quieter in that sense because nothing seems groundbreaking until a few chapters in, when you start seeing the consequences and you start seeing things rolling out. Another weird that I have done, let me think, because I have, as you can see, I do a lot of weird stuff simply to try. This one
Mhm.
is the latest one, and what I did in that case, I'm changing the narrator. So at some point, the narrator goes from first person to third person. Why? Because it has some. Think of it this way. I'm trying not to spoil my own story. You're narrating. You're in your head thinking in first person all the time. What happens if you suddenly start thinking on third person about yourself? What does that mean? Right? So, and if you're in third person, are you still in control of yourself? Right? So that's I play a lot with the themes, basically because I'm a theme-driven writer. So I always try to loop the mechanics and the choices back into the theme of the story, right? Like the robot I mentioned, if it's about knowledge enables choice, you don't seek knowledge, you have fewer choices. In that case, it was. But yeah, I think the craziest one was then kicking the player off the story, and then the story that remembers itself. That was pretty difficult to achieve and to make it consistent. Things that I have also done, but that's the whole platform. We have effects. So sometimes I can, if I'm describing a thunder, you get like a thunder overlay. In one case, I have the character going through a very dark room, so you have the whole text around gets blackened on the edges. And I remember that I gave it to someone, and they read the scene and they came and told me, like, it feels oppressive. And I was just like, yes, I did. Because it helps. You can get away with that because it's interactive fiction. It toes the lines between book and game. And the reader is more prone to accept that, and that also changes the show don't tell. In a book, you probably have to describe it was oppressive. In here, I just got away with not saying anything and giving you the black frame. I'm literally showing you that's oppressive. So yeah, I have those are things that I have done a lot of those basically.
Yeah. Have you learned anything surprising from how readers engage with your stories?
Oh, definitely. I have had a lot of. Some people will just read one path and that's it. That's a story in their mind. While other people will just go ahead and try to find every little detail, and try to, yeah, find every clue, take every different choice I have as if they were tracking it. I have also found readers that are okay with more cozy choices but get very anxious when they face like a more relevant choice, right? Some people, if you're a gamer, if you have played narrative games, then you're fine. You're probably going to, but I have found some people that, yeah, it didn't ring for them, so that's okay. I don't think it's a matter of, I think it's a matter of the interactivity, that they just want to follow the story and don't want to feel the burden of making the story. That also happens. I have had some strange comments as well, like that in This is the Grim Dark story. And I remember that when I gave that one to one person, that's the one that you end up killing a child. They come in and told me, like, I'm surprised about the choices I made. Like the choices that person had taken, they were surprised about how they found themselves taking the evil choices all the time, So it's don't assume that because your readership, it's, I don't know, children, YA or something like that, that they are going to prefer the easiest choice because they can surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always a matter of how you present that. Because if you make it compelling to them to go for the option that kills half the population of your story, they are going to try to take it. It's all a matter of presentation, basically. And I think it's very, as a writer, I'm always asking myself, like, how can I involve them on the story and make them actually want to take a story somewhere? That's, again, the ludonarrative harmony. What does that?
Yeah, it seems to me that maybe some people who enjoy playing role-playing games would very much like interactive fiction, whereas if that's not a background that you're coming from, it feels a little stranger to get to make those choices.
Yeah,
Um,
especially, I think it's also a matter of, are you going for a text-based approach? Because in that case, people that only read books that are not gamers may feel compelled to try it, but then they may not know whether to trust you or not as an author
mm,
about the choices that you are giving them, right? And if you are going for a visual novel, that probably is going to attract more gamers or other people that are more used to that. So it's also the thing that no writer wants to, how you market your story, the people you attract and whether they are going to play it or not. Yeah.
yeah. All right, I think we might have one more question coming in. Are there any questions that I didn't ask you that you want to mention?
Oh, I will say, like, the most basic advice, it's just
Sure.
do it. Do it. Practice.
No, that's
And
good.
yeah, I know it sounds silly, but if you don't try, you won't know, right? And I will say the second thing is give yourself a word limit, very fixed. That's it. The whole story is going to be 1,000 words. And then you think yourself, like, do you need to streamline the narration? Do you need to make the choices more relevant? How quickly do you have to present the choice, right? So that will basically push your limits. Once you are comfortable, literally, I always say that Unearthed Stories is my playground, because every weird thing that I want to do just to learn, I will do it. Like, I told myself, I will write a story that remembers that you wrote it, simply because I wanted to see what that was. I will use multiple narrators because I want to. Let's try to learn, like, don't be
Hmm.
afraid of trying to learn, but also be very mindful about what you want to learn. Pick one thing, learn that single thing throughout a single story. Once you finish it, pick another thing, practice in another story. So it's a process, of course, and it takes a lot of time to get to learn that.
Yeah. So it looks like we've got the question. I hear a lot of people say they make the bad choices because they often lead to more interesting stories. So I suppose, how would you make the good choices just as appealing? Or is this a player personal choice thing that you shouldn't worry about?
To me, it's both. So some people will just go for the evil choice all the time.
Hmm.
I think it also depends on the genres that they read. The thing about making the good choices appealing is you have to some extent, foreshadow the impact of your choice, right? If you're about to offer them to save the kid but endanger your main character to the point that they could die, you don't need to do much, just a thought in the main character. If I save them, I will unlock this, or I have a chance to reach this person. That's enough. That seeds the doubt on whether they should choose it. What's the reward? At the end of the day, you have to tease your reader, right? You have to basically, if they are actively trying to be the lawful good character, there has to be a reason for why they are choosing to do that, right? In Mass Effect, you choose to play a paragon because that may give you a choice of having more allies, because you're not killing your allies. So it's the same thing. How do you want to tease them? And you have to put that up before the choice, right? Because before the choice, at least how I write them, my characters will have to think about their choices. If you are, suppose that you get a friend that invites you to go to dinner, you think about it. I could go, but I will come back late, and tomorrow I have to wake up earlier. Or, but I haven't seen them in a long time. I could get, your character can do that. And in that thought, just before the choices, you have to put up a few words about the reward that every choice will have. Especially because if they are impactful choices, your character will think a lot about them. And that's another thing. You can present the choices, then give your character, your reader, the choice to think about what to do before actually doing it. Right? Because in that case, that's also building up to the character. That's a more mindful character that doesn't rush up. They will think through. And then you can, as I generally do it in terms of coding, it's a loop. I will show you, choice A, B, no, wait, I will think. You have a little path here, and then you come back and now you see these two choices. So you can do that as well. Give them the choice to think about it, because in that bit of in that place they may find more information, and that will change their minds.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, I think that we've asked all the questions, and thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us about
Thank you
interactive
so much
fiction.
for inviting me. Yeah.
And if anyone does have any additional questions that we didn't get to that I missed or anything like that, if you ask them in the Discord, if Livia has time, she can come back and maybe take a look at those. And yeah, we'll post some links and some of those options for places where you can make interactive fiction.
Yeah, I will post that up later.
Perfect.
Yeah. And for
Perfect.
questions, I'm in Australia, which means that I will probably be active in the afternoon because it's known for me. But if you post in more USA times, I will probably answer in the morning. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you all so much. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your Write Hive, and we'll see you around.
Bye.